we want you to be able to use this information to help expand voting rights, even if that is on just within your home or your workplace. Okay, so the overall goal of ACLU at large and locally, our advocacy at this time during this rapid response period of COVID-19 is to implement administrative policies that will ensure equal and safe, healthy voting access without at all diminishing our ability to exercise this fundamental right. The secondary advocacy goal we have is that with this information and with working with us in the campaigns department, and we'll be able to mobilize fellow ACLU supporters and educate them so they can also advocate in their communities. And then to just give a quick overview of the agenda so you know what's coming down the pipe and kind of get a flow of the presentation. You can see that on your right column here, and in case any folks are on the phone, I'll read through it. We'll go through foundations. Like I said in this presentation, we're not going to go through the entire history, but we do want to kind of set a foundation so we're all working off of the same concepts, and that we all kind of have our heads in the same place before we go into all the COVID craziness. Then we'll kind of outline broadly what are the concerns with COVID and our ability to administer or deliver elections and get people access to the ballot. Then we'll review ACLU specific recommendations. So ACLU has given recommendations for the federal and state level, and we will review those separately. Then, like I was saying, we'll go into Colorado's voting systems. What's the life of a ballot look like in Colorado? Where do we fall within these recommendations and remedies that ACLU has put out? And so we'll go a little more in depth there. And then, of course, ending with advocacy actions. How can we operationalize all this knowledge that we've learned? And let me tell you that there's a lot there. And I also do want to make a final disclaimer is that while I might not have all the answers, and admittedly, I'm not the best at memorizing statistics, I am very good at following up. I'd like this to be the beginning of a conversation. This crisis is unfolding. The way that states are responding is changing day to day. So for folks who are really dedicated to this or just want to know, this is just the beginning of a conversation. We will continue to reach out, provide information, webinars, and stuff like that. And so I'm committing to following up on stuff, but I will also send out further reading resources, so places you can really dig into how states are responding to COVID, where you can see various statistics, where you can see where we have sued certain states, that sort of thing. So this is just the beginning. Okay, so again, talking about foundations. What do we mean by foundations? So by foundations, we kind of want to review general principles, concepts, and definitions that will guide this conversation. Of course, this is not, as I've already said probably 2 or 3 times, this is not entirely inclusive of all of the things to do with voting rights. I'm just trying to pick out what we really need to understand currently what's going on with COVID and our ability to access the ballot. Okay, so here we have our ACLU voting rights principles. And they are extremely straightforward. All citizens should be able to vote. Voting should be free and easy. All votes should count equally. Simple, straightforward, what the Constitution says, presentation over. Obviously, that is not the case. We know that these seemingly simple principles have been fought over tooth and nail, and often with even bloodshed, just to be implemented. And that fight has been going on since the day our country was founded and up until this very second. And see, the good news about that history, though, or what it is, that people have always fought for their voting rights, no matter the tactics of any adversaries, which we'll get into, and have been successful. And what that history also shows us is that, or what it implies to us, is that voting is powerful. People in power, dominant majorities, whatever interests, wouldn't put so much time, effort, and money into suppressing or stopping people from voting if voting wasn't powerful. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, so really briefly touching on these topics of voter disenfranchisement and voter suppression. So often, like in news or articles or conversation, even disenfranchisement and suppression are used interchangeably, which is fine. But for the sake of this presentation, we're going to kind of try and distinguish the two. So voter disenfranchisement is like an explicit revocation of your right to vote, or just completely making you unable to exercise your right to vote. So historically, we have seen this over and over again. Of course, during the Civil War, Black men were explicitly revoked or not allowed to vote. We know the Chinese Exclusion Act explicitly changed the definition of citizen to intentionally leave out Chinese Americans from voting. Then we have voter suppression. Voter suppression often follows re-enfranchisement, right? So we know that every wave of folks who gain voting rights, there's a pop-up of new suppression tactics to attempt to stop that same group from voting. But again, we know that every time that adversaries come and try and block the vote, voting rights advocates fight and often, if not always, win. So voting suppression is intentionally blocking your ability to exercise that right to vote. So sometimes I like to think of disenfranchisement as closing the door on your right to vote, while voter suppression is the door is open, but there's a ton of obstacles in the way. And those obstacles are put in intentionally and sometimes insurmountable. So historically, we know that looks like poll taxes, that looks like literacy tests, that looks like violent intimidation. And then today, and especially in 2020, we'll briefly touch on what that looks like and making some distinguishments along the way. So misinformation. Misinformation is just false information that is erroneous, but not intentional. So I have been in the grocery store before and I've heard people say, no, you have to vote. You have to register to vote 7 days before the election in Colorado. And that's just seemingly misinformation because it's friend to friend talking about it. That's false. That's not true. You can vote up to and on election day. So that's just people not being having the clear, proper information. Disinformation is the evil twin of misinformation. It is intentionally false information with that intention being to stop people from voting. So it's far more nefarious, it's far more malignant. Our very own presidential administration likes to spread disinformation pertaining to mail ballots, saying that they're wrought with fraud, which is statistically false. And there's also intimidation to worry about this year. Intimidation often looks like putting hate groups, but also putting law enforcement or militarized folks at polling places. And The Intercept just put out an article that is detailing a conservative gathering where people are organizing to mobilize across the country to put militarized folks in polling places. And the intention there is to scare people, particularly communities of color and immigrant communities, from voting. And we'll touch a little bit more on that. And so this slide is just, again, to hone in on the point that all of voting rights have been gained through the struggle of everyday advocates and activists. And that when we look back, we see that clearly who is wrong in this picture. But during that time, if you think about it, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the folks pictured here, SNCC, which was a student-led civil rights organization led by students of color, those students were probably framed as being radical or extreme or being impatient about change, and they should be more moderate and less disruptive. But now we see, when we look back on history, it is clear who the protagonist is. So just something to keep in mind when you're in the trenches fighting for rights and you feel like you're not making progress or that you outcast. So also paying some homage to these folks. Okay, it is also worth touching on or making a distinguishment between federal and state powers and how that has to do with election administration. And also, side note, when we're talking election administration, yes, it is as dry as it sounds. We're talking about the mechanics of voting. So how your ballots are printed, how your ballots are received, how you can return them, how they are tabulated, how you can get registered to vote, all of the mechanics. Okay, so let's look at federal versus state. So generally, this is very generalized, federal government has the power to put in place requirements pertaining to voting rights and voting administration. And then it's up to the states on what that implementation process, what implementation and the very processes that follow look like. So an example, and why the federal government needs to step in and make those requirements, it happens when states are not upholding voters' constitutional rights to cast a ballot. So some really quick examples of the 15th Amendment, which granted free slaves the right to vote, or male slaves the right to vote after the Civil War. Because even though slaves were freed, it's not like states were taking it upon themselves to grant access to voting. So the federal government intervened. Then we have the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was another case of the federal government needing to intervene because state governments were not upholding voters' constitutional rights to equal access to the ballot. There was a ton of discrimination to suppress particularly the Black vote. Okay, and then similar, there's a bit of a parallel, but not exactly the same. You can see a similar dynamic with state and county. There's less tension mostly, but it is the state that creates laws and requirements for voting, and then there is some variation in the ways counties carry out those requirements. So it's our state legislature can make laws that affect voting. Our Secretary of State's office can make rules, and they really house all of the administration of elections. So they put that guidance out there, and then counties execute the actual elections. That's why when you go to vote, you see so much from your county because they're the ones doing the counting, distributing the ballots, staffing the poll people. And so you do see some variation, less variation than you see state to state in terms of voting processes, but even Colorado, there's some variation between counties. For example, with ballot curing, and curing simply means resolving a dispute with your ballot. So let's say you sign your ballot and the signature doesn't match your signature in the voter file. So then you have the opportunity in Colorado anyway to resolve that discrepancy. And what differs in county is exactly how you can do that ballot curing process. All counties must provide a way to cure a ballot, but there is those methods can change. For example, in Denver, very recently, they started allowing you to cure your ballot through text message. Take a picture of your signature and send that in. But that's not offered in every county. Okay, this one's really important because we're about to slide into talking about COVID. And I'm sure if folks have been hearing the news, you hear absentee and vote by mail. And again, we want to distinguish these two concepts because they are different. So voting absentee is voting and saying, hey, I wasn't able to make it to the polls, so I have to vote far away. And every state offers a way to vote by absentee ballot. However, again, what that looks like exactly varies state by state. For example, some states require you to request an absentee ballot, while other states will automatically just send absentee ballots to all eligible voters. And this is important for the COVID related issues, is some states require you to include an excuse as to why you should be allowed to vote absentee. And right now it's about a third of states who still require such an excuse. Vote by mail is different. It means that no matter what, automatically all eligible voters receive a ballot through the mail, no excuses, no requests. It's just the way that votes. There's only a handful of states that do this. Oregon is an all-mail ballot state, meaning that you don't even have an in-person voting option, pretty much. And Colorado is a mix of in-person. You will receive your ballot. Every eligible voter will receive a ballot in mail, but they also have the option to go vote in person. And in California, it varies by county. There are a lot of counties in California that do vote by mail, but it's not uniform throughout the state. Okay, moving on to COVID concerns, what we're all here for, right? So like I've already said a couple times, one of major concerns is administration. So how are we going to deliver elections in a way that is compliant with public safety? And we also want to keep in mind that there are going to be a lot of changes that need to take place in a relatively condensed timeline. So I'm just going to put that out there for some context setting. And we'll move into what those are. So one of the primary concerns, and what Delana was talking about, or Delana and I have been talking about today, is transmission concerns, particularly pertaining to in-person voting. And it's not just for voters, but also for the poll workers who are essential to carry out elections. Our case study here is Milwaukee, with just a couple of weeks ago, really, they held an election. All of Wisconsin held an election. There was a ton of pushback. ACLU, voting rights advocates, actually a lot of politicians, the governor in Wisconsin were asking the state to postpone their election because it was early April when things were really, everyone was on lockdown. And the reasoning behind that push was, hey, we're not prepared. We don't have the infrastructure or the ability yet or the time to put in place the protections necessary to keep people safe while in-person voting. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court said that no, they should go forward with in-person voting, as did the state legislature. And so we saw many, many cases of folks waiting in line for 2 to 3 hours, crowded polling places, and this disproportionately affected voters of color. There's the voters of color in Milwaukee specifically, who are already being disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 crisis, who are put in even more risk just to cast their ballot. And it's also a chilling reminder of it was Black Americans who by far led the civil rights movement and are still risking their lives to cast a ballot today. The second concern is disparities creating disenfranchisement. What does this mean? Virginia is a perfect case study for this. So in Virginia, to cast an absentee ballot, you must have a witness sign onto your absentee ballot. Obviously, to comply, especially for the vulnerable groups, to comply with social distancing and other pandemic safety regulations, there are folks who don't have the ability to have a witness sign their ballot. And this particularly affects older voters and older voters of color. So in Virginia, ACLU sued. We also have the issue of poll taxes via postage and ID laws. I mean, primarily in COVID crisis, the concern is postage because so many people have to vote absentee. But there's still the issue of ID laws. I can share out in my follow-up a great fact sheet about how voter ID laws are disproportionately affect low-income folks, and how that they cost up for between $100 and $150 on average just to require an ID, including transportation, all the documentation that you often have to pay for. But anyway, zooming back to COVID, there's also the issue of poll taxes via postage. So right now, people don't really have the choice to go vote in person, especially if they're in one of those vulnerable groups, immune compromised, older, caretaker. And so their only option is to vote by mail. However, if the state requires or vote by absentee ballot through the mail, But the state requires that you pay for postage, that is absolutely akin to a poll tax because people have no other choice. And of course, this disproportionately affects low-income voters. There's also the issue of misinformation, which we can absolutely anticipate to continue as states try and rapidly adjust their election administration systems to carry out elections during this pandemic. And again, reminding us that misinformation is erroneous information and not necessarily intentionally disruptive information. And so we see this in Ohio, where it's a very convoluted process for absentee voting. And because that process is so convoluted, people will incorrectly repeat facts and misinform their neighbors and their friends. And that serves, and that is we know that will be a concern throughout the country as things develop. So what to do about all of this? So ACLU, of course, has lots of recommendations. And we will separate these from federal and state recommendations. Okay, so federal recommendations. One, to require all states to have no excuse absentee voting. And the second one is to require at least 14 days of early voting, including one Saturday and one Sunday. Now, going back to when we were distinguishing federal from state power, the federal government has the constitutional authority to make these requirements of states. So we say they should do more than just implore states by providing funds. It should be required, because those are very different. The other two recommendations have to do with allocation of funds. So as we are imploring Congress to include $3 billion for states to implement election administration changes. $3 billion probably seems like a lot of money. Definitely seems like a lot of money to me. But when you think about it, and you think about how much money we're spending on all the stimulus, when you think about the costs of dramatically shifting our election administration in a very condensed timeline, it's going to be expensive. You have the cost of printing, postage, software, tabulation machines, personal protective equipment, training of new poll workers, security for new ways of counting ballots. Like, that is all very expensive. Separately from that, we implore Congress to allocate $4 million to the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. So the EAC was created in the early 2000s via the Help America Vote Act. This commission's entire purpose is pretty much to serve as a coordinator between the federal government and state governments. As you can probably see, all this is very bureaucratic and wonky, so you definitely need a body to help coordinate the two. And especially when we're with all the funding that we're requesting, you're going to need a robust mechanism that will help to distribute and monitor those funds. And we're also imploring that the EAC takes a role in educating voters and helping states educate voters about any and all changes. Okay, going through state, we have about 10 recommendations. Number one is to extend deadlines. So if there is a deadline for absentee voting that can be extended, it can and it should. We are also recommending that states allow postmarked absentee ballots. The other one is to expand methods for application and return of absentee ballots. So if a state solely provides for voters to apply for an absentee ballot through the mail, we recommend that they put in place a way to do that through email or online. And for returning absentee ballots, an example is putting in place a curbside drop-off. Another thing we are recommending is prepaid postage on absentee applications and ballots. Again, that goes back to the Georgia lawsuit. And we are suing because Georgia requires postage for both the application and the ballots. And there's actually studies, and I believe this is reflected in one of the reference articles that I will share in the follow-up materials. But there are studies that show one of the biggest anxieties voters have is around this postage question, especially as mail becomes less common, that people don't have postage in their house, let alone if they're able to afford it. And there's also the issue of early processing of absentee ballots. This one's interesting and important because not all states count absentee ballots at the same time. We can definitely anticipate an increase of the use of the absentee ballot system. So it'll be even more important that county clerks in states do not wait until election day to count. There will be a huge bottleneck. There's more room for error, and it's not in the voters' favor to have to wait weeks and weeks for absentee ballot to be counted. And right now it's about a dozen states that don't start counting until election day, and 4 states that count after election day for absentee ballots. We also are recommending that states provide notice of discrepancy and opportunity to cure. So we kind of touched on that when we were talking about the distinguishment between state and counties when it comes to elections. But not every state I think it's 19 states provide a way for voters to cure their ballot, again, meaning that they can resolve a discrepancy with their ballot. And again, I think it's only 19 states that allow for that. And it'll be super important that voters are given that opportunity, because we can reasonably expect a lot of stress on these systems. So there needs to be a route for people to make sure their vote is counted. And all of these could be implemented either through legislation, executive order, or administrative rule, depending on the state. But we're not done yet, kind of moving into outside of the realm of ballots. We are recommending states eliminate any special requirements for first-time voters. So there are states that require you to register to vote in person. And obviously that is unreasonable at this time, so to waive those kind of requirements. We're also definitely recommending for states and counties to keep open in-person polling places. And the reason for this is really important. Polling places, and especially in Colorado, serve as service centers, really, whose services are utilized the most by historically disenfranchised people, or voters who need accommodations. For example, voters with disabilities, voters who have English as a second language, and a lot of young voters and new voters really go in person to help get set up and figure out how to vote. And so we definitely want to keep those options open, because part of our voting rights principles is equal access, and part of equal access is providing accommodations. But not just keep them open as they did in Milwaukee without adjusting for the pandemic, or in Wisconsin without adjusting for the pandemic. Of course, we strongly recommend protections for poll workers, including personal protective equipment and special trainings. And also to recruit new poll workers who do not fall into the vulnerable groups. We know right now, most poll workers are over the age of 60, and that's a vulnerable group. So the state should put in place a way to recruit younger, less vulnerable poll workers and extra poll workers to help staff. Also, speaking to accommodations is the expansion of voter help hotlines. We know that even though some in-person polling places will stay open, there are going to be folks who for they're a vulnerable population, or they don't feel safe going because of risk of transmission. But that doesn't mean that the state's obligation to provide accommodations disappears. Doesn't mean that at all. So one of the ways to help with that is to expand voter help hotlines, and for example, include more languages or more hotline workers who can speak a diversity of languages to help make those accommodations or fill that accommodation gap. And finally, the cherry on top of all of this, which super essential, especially from an advocacy angle, is aggressive public education. none of this can, well, some of it can, but it's going to be really important if our goal is to increase voter participation and access to the ballot. It's going to take an aggressive public education campaign, aggressive and sustained, and the onus is on the state to do a lot of that. And of course, organizations like ACLU will do that as well. That was a lot. I'm gonna have a sip of water, but that's a scope broadly, and I hope it's helpful to what's going on throughout the state and what can be done. Throughout the country. But it's really important that we remind ourselves about what's specific to Colorado. What does our election system look like? What rights do we have? Where do we fall in terms of all of those recommendations? And while some states are really horrific in their voting rights, Colorado is actually a leader. And that isn't to minimize the struggles of other states, but it's to just focus on where we're at and kind of cut through any misinformation, let alone disinformation. And it's really important for people with this information to spread it in their networks. Voting systems can be confusing and bureaucratic. And so you as an advocate can really help cut through some of that noise by knowing what goes on in Colorado. So you'd be like, yes, I know what's going on in Georgia is scary, but luckily you can vote by mail here, and kind of pivot back to making Colorado voters feel empowered. Because we just know that when we talk about how terrible things are, which I am a cynic, don't get me wrong. When we talk about how terrible the state of voting rights is for folks, without providing clear information on what's going on for them locally, then you can depress voter turnout. So let's get into Colorado's voting system. Colorado's voting system was overhauled when the Voter Access and Modernization Act passed at the Colorado State Legislature in 2013. And so this put in a series of policy shifts. So one of them is same-day voter registration. So in Colorado, you can you can register to vote on election day. If you have friends in other states who are like, I don't know where to start when it comes to voting advocacy, before COVID anyway, the policy that increased voter participation the most was same-day voter registration, because we know most people who register vote the same day are younger voters or first-time voters too. Colorado is one of those mail ballot states. Like I had said, every eligible voter in Colorado receives a ballot through the mail. But just because they receive a ballot through the mail does not mean that they have to vote by mail. Coloradans have the choice to either return their ballot by mail through USPS, United States Postal Service, through a drop box, which is what is pictured on your screen, or they can go in person to vote in what we call voter service polling centers, or VSPCs. These are different than merely your precinct polling location. In fact, these got rid of precinct-specific polling locations and replaced them with voter service polling centers to really emphasize that they're a place for voters to receive accommodations, services, help, and not just to cast their ballot. And so folks can go receive services at any VSPC in their county. They don't have to go to one that is specific to their precinct. Also, part of the implementation is early voting. Colorado, we have almost 3 weeks. We have 3 weeks to vote. Our voting service polling centers are open for over a week of that time. So that means people can go in person to receive services during for a good chunk of that early voting time. The other good, awesome thing about Colorado is that going back to the drop boxes, again, what is pictured on your screen. So while you have to visit a voting service polling location that is specific to your county, you can drop your ballot, or you can return your ballot at any ballot drop box in the state. So if you are from the Eastern Plains and you happen to be in Durango looking at the aspens in the fall, but you have your ballot with you and you just want to get rid of it, you can drop it off on the western slope and it'll still be counted back in the eastern plains where you live. Okay, what are the effects of all of this? You know, you'll probably hear this a lot as mail ballot voting is being debated more centrally. Is that it's just too much. It actually, and this is a great argument for the financially conservative folks, is that it decreases cost by over half. Colorado's cost per ballot were reduced from like 14 to, I think it was $8. It seems counterintuitive for sure. Like how could that be? How could that be true? And it's because with so many options to vote, there's less of a need to put in polling staff, which is the main cost when it comes to election administration. And also, there's less need for provisional ballots because folks are being mailed their ballots. The other effect is that we, as Colorado, are a national leader in electoral systems and in voter access. Right now, as states are in contingency planning on how to administer elections, various advocates as well as government leaders are at the table guiding other states. So it's, as a voting rights coordinator, I think something to be proud of. Another thing that's important to touch on is the security measures that we have in place for Colorado. I know in 2016 and 2018, there's a lot of fear, and that fear is still here among newer fears about, you know, particularly electronic voting systems being hacked and that sort of thing. Colorado is said to be the safest state to cast a ballot in terms of integrity of your ballot. One of the reasons is that every ballot has a paper trail. So even if you were to vote in person, a paper ballot is printed out, you look at it, and then you put it in the ballot box. And obviously, if you're voting by mail, there's a paper trail there. And what us voting nerds like to say is that you can't hack a paper ballot. We also have a robust signature verification program. So that means when you sign your signature, it's run through several systems, both computer and human monitor. And so it goes through, computers look at it and humans look at it to see if it matches the voter file. I'm sure for some of you who are pretty hardcore on your voting rights news and advocacy know that there are a lot of states whose signature verification processes are very racially biased, and seeing mostly communities of colors, especially in Georgia, having their signatures rejected. And there's also a lot of states those type of states that will reject a signature in a disproportionate manner and also not provide an opportunity for that person to resolve the issue. That is far less of an issue in Colorado. Most of the signatures, the vast majority of the signatures that were disputed in 2016 were from white voters. And we also have in place that ballot curing process, which helps kind of resolve that issue. Getting super wonky here, we practice a risk limiting audit. So all states and counties have a way to practice an audit. So that's after you vote, to go back and see, did the vote count match the ballots, basically. But in Colorado, we practice the risk limiting audit, which means that what it looks like, I'm going to get in the weeds on this. What it looks like is county clerks and the Secretary of State gather like in a hotel in Denver, have 6-sided dice of different color. They have a Colorado voter roll the dice. Well, I hope to God one day I could be that Colorado voter. I don't know the process. So anyway, they roll the dice. The sequence of numbers that come from the dice, or die, I don't know the proper plural, become the number of the ballot numbers that all the county clerks then go and pull. So whatever the sequence is, all 64 Colorado counties have to go back, pull those ballots, and make sure that they line up with the vote count by hand. If one county screws that up, then all 64 counties have to restart that process again. And Colorado is the first state ever to practice this in 2017, and we were successful, and none of the states had to, or none of the counties had to go back and recount, because I imagined it's a good form of peer pressure. So that's an overview of Colorado's election system. Actually, I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna go back twice. So as you can see, we fall in line with ACLU recommendations. But that doesn't mean there's not going to be voter confusion, and there's not going to be still contingency work for us to do as a state and as advocates. We'll get to that. But before we get to that, this is just a quick reminder of who is eligible to vote in Colorado. You do have to be a Colorado resident for 22 days prior to the election, 18 years old and a citizen per federal requirements as well. And then you cannot be incarcerated for a felony conviction. Last year, largely thanks to the work of our partner organization, the Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition, and our awesome work of our policy team here at ACLU Colorado, we were able to re-enfranchise people on parole so that they can vote. People in jail for misdemeanors are allowed to vote, and people in jail simply awaiting bail are allowed to vote in Colorado. And so Colorado does have voter ID requirements. However, they are broad, and it doesn't mean a photo ID. For example, you can use a utility statement. And even if you went to vote and you forgot all of these forms, then you could sign an affidavit attesting to your identity. And again, I do want to reiterate the fact that Colorado has same-day voter registration. So, hopefully you don't have to do it in the age of COVID, but if you were at an in-person polling place at 7 p.m. in line, but you never registered to vote, you could still, as long as you don't get out of line, you are still eligible to, or you're still able to register to vote and vote that same day. Tell your friends, tell your family. It's very exciting, very cool, I think. And it increases voter participation. Okay, having painted that rosy picture, that doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of work to do in terms of voting during COVID. And again, our newest principle to our voting rights principles, no one should have to choose between their health and their right to vote. So what it's gonna look like in Colorado for us is we all hands on deck for doing public education and really, really encouraging people to participate and vote by mail. In 2018, 95% of people voted by mail, and for us that means by drop box or through the postal service. But it's critical that we let people know, the other 5%, that they should vote by mail, and to remind people, especially during this time of fear and crisis, that they do have the ability to vote by mail and that they should exercise that. It will also be for Colorado, our contingency planning is, and this is super pressing right now, is we need folks to help administer elections. We need poll workers who are not in vulnerable groups. So that brings us to my favorite part, calls to action. How do we make all this work actionable? As you can see, I have jammed lots of ways to get involved and take action into this slide. Don't you worry, I will follow up with this in an email. One thing you can do right now is sign a petition. It's a nationwide petition imploring Congress to put in place all of those recommendations we outlined, $3 billion for implementation, a requirement for no excuse absentee voting. And so you can sign that because we know that there's yet another stimulus package being debated. So it's a great time to do that advocacy, and we'll keep you in touch, especially if you're outside of the metro area, but we'll keep in touch for other ways to take congressional action. And also, just so folks know, because I didn't mention it before, the amount of money that ended up being allocated in that major coronavirus relief package from the CARES Act, it ended up being $400 million, which a lot of voting rights experts say is very inadequate. So we have an opportunity to fight again for this funding for the next major piece of legislation, which is in discussion now, federal legislation. Huge thing folks here in Colorado can, should, and need to do is update their voter registration. And even if you think it's updated, go and check it out. And for people on this call, not just you, but your friends and your family. It's especially important for younger voters. Voters under the age of 35 on average move about like once a year. And so we see that reflected in the amount of in that 5% of people who go to vote in person last year. About, some of them just do it because it's traditional for them, but a lot of them were the under 35 demographic. And often that can happen because they didn't receive their mail ballot because their voter registration was updated because they had moved. And so a couple of things here. One, you might be living somewhere or sheltering in place somewhere, or your needs might change from here to the primary to the election. So you have to live somewhere, whether it's temporary or permanent. And what you can do is online, you can change where your ballot is mailed to. So again, if you live in Denver, but you have to be in Grand Junction working or taking care of your family, so you're going to be living in Grand Junction for a while, or you're just even going to be living there during election season, you can go online and change your mailing address. So it means you're still voting at home in Denver, like you're voting for who your representatives would be in your permanent residential home, but you're just receiving your ballot in Grand Junction. That is an excellent way to prevent transmission of COVID and to stay safe while voting. So reminding people their mailing address can be separate from their voting address. And you can do all of that by simply going online. You can go to govotecolorado.com, which is the Secretary of State's website. Remember, the Secretary of State is the one who oversees all of the election administration. And then you will look up your voter registration, hit edit, and then scroll down to update your mailing address. And again, just making sure that everything is up to date, even if you think it is. Off of that, you can also fully register to vote online. You either need your Colorado license or ID number or the last four of your social. Okay, and also in order to receive a mail ballot, you just need to make sure that that address is updated 7 days prior to the election. Another way that you can get involved, which I think is very compelling and important, is to join our 2020 Voting Rights Volunteer Team. We already had huge plans for 2020. It's a massive presidential election. Suddenly, there is even more urgency around getting people to vote. And part of that, as I've already touched on a couple times, is helping with education and helping with election administration through through working the polls and protecting folks from intimidation. So again, there are a lot of ways to get involved with the 2020 election. And if you go to our website, which I will share with you, aclu-co.org/fight-for-voting-rights, you can submit your form, and then we can know that you've identified yourself as someone who wants to really help with this advocacy work, especially during 2020. Also on that form, you'll have like several options. You don't have to fill it out, but you have the option to fill it out and really dig into how would you like to get involved. Is it you want to help with a voter hotline? You want to help get out the vote by writing postcards and making phone calls. You want to help educate by becoming a social media ambassador and spreading content to your networks. All of those options are there and you can identify. You can also choose which issues you really care about. This information is really helpful for us so we can better serve you. There is a unique opportunity. The deadline is April 27th for folks to submit public comment to their county clerks on the county clerk's 2020 election plans. So the good example is to say, hey, I know in this county that we never have anywhere to drop our Dropbox off at, and it's always so far away. You can put that comment and submit it to your county clerk. They really, really value that feedback. And because it's so local, you have a large impact when you submit public comment. To do that, just simply reach out to voting@aclu-co.org, and we'll set you up there. And then also, if you have special skills, like if you have translation ability, you're an attorney who's interested in joining, helping with the hotlines, please also be specific and identify that by emailing voting@aclu-co. We know that the Secretary of State and some other voting partners are talking about the needs to have good bilingual folks who can work hotlines or help and help translate materials. For example, like direct translation really doesn't work a lot of times. There's times when election officials were trying to translate materials into another language, and the translation for early voting came out as before voting, and obviously that's really confusing messaging that doesn't increase participation. So if you have any skills like that, please reach out. And a little secret here, I'm the one behind voting at ACLU of Colorado, so I'm more than happy to help. Finally, educate and involve your networks. Again, it's really, really important that you tell people in your networks about Colorado's voting system, about what they can do, how they can get involved, why it's so important to vote by mail this year. This isn't just raw stuff. It is proven that you are the most powerful messenger when it comes to your friends, family, and loved ones. You have the biggest sway, even bigger than the ACLU. And so for these first three actions, signing the petition, updating registration, and joining the voting rights team, I would like to challenge folks to get involved, at least 3 people per action. Again, this seems kind of arbitrary to be like 3 people, really, Jen? But there's a reason. 1, when we set goals, we're more likely to do something. And 2, again, this point cannot be made enough. You are the most powerful messenger when it comes to, or you're the most powerful force when it comes to increasing voter participation amongst your loved ones. And I'll say it again, just like social isolating, just like the precautions we're taking to keep ourselves, our loved ones, our neighbors, our service workers safe through social distancing and shelter in place. It seems so small on an individual level, but the statistics and the science shows that it has a massive impact when we all do it together. So again, no escaping me. I will email all these ways to get involved. And I'm always happy to be connected to other volunteers or people in your network who you think would be good volunteers with us in our work at ACLU. Done talking. Delana, any questions for me?
There are actually a few questions for you, but I think it's going to be my new goal in life to get you to be that person who gets to roll that dice at that.
Thank you.
I think that'll be my organizing thing. Just a reminder, if you would like to submit a question, now is the time in the Q&A box, but we have a couple. And this one is something Jen and I have been talking about a ton, and we have been talking about this in our department. I'm assuming our embrace of Zoom as a response to this COVID-19 pandemic will change how we organize politically forever. I personally hope that someday we can go knock on doors again and be out in the community. But for right now, yes, we are going to have to figure out new ways to do that. What do you say, Jen?
Yes, I think that actually also puts even further emphasis on the importance of us tapping into our own networks. Because those are the folks we do have access to, and we have a lot of persuasive power in those networks. And I know even for me, I'm very, politically outspoken, but it can be uncomfortable for me to talk to certain family members about, have you voted? Are you going to? So it takes a little more than I can be. I'm just trying to say I can be more comfortable knocking on a stranger's door sometimes than talking to my cousin about voting. But I challenge everyone to do that, because that is the work that will increase participation. And especially as disinformation, we know disinformation is so bad right now, and people are don't know what to trust. And because trust in messengers is so low, again, very important that loved ones communicate and advocate within their own circles.
Yeah, and even, you know, half my family is, you know, very politically different than me. But the one thing that they appreciate is when I give them information, you know, that technical information on voting. Like, oh, you can register to vote. Oh, you should go online and change your address. That kind of stuff. And research shows that is some of the best information we can spread and some of the most useful information. So you don't have to get political, you can just get technical.
I like that.
And then we have people thanking us and saying, hi, Elaine, we miss you. And Roger, we're happy to answer your questions. Last question is, what are the benefits of having in-person voting and vote by mail, like Colorado does, versus only having vote by mail, like Oregon does?
Love this question. Because we know that the in-person polling places allow for voter assistance. It greatly expands the ability for people to receive accommodations that they are constitutionally granted. So again, one of the major examples is English as a second language. It's governed by federal and state laws, the amount of or the training that poll workers are required to have, you know, in terms of being bilingual or whatever the jurisdiction's language. And so in-person voting is really important for people to be able to receive those accommodations. Same with voters with disabilities, you know, like special screens for visual impairments or guides that are specially trained in the polling locations. And finally, another reason in-person voting is important, or it's important to have both, is because we know that folks that use in-person voting, a lot of them are young and first-time voters. And so, you know, we want everyone to vote, so we want that to be available for them. And this year with a ton of protection.
Yeah, it is kind of fun, you know, to go and pull that lever. I think everybody should do that at least once, but maybe not this year.
Yeah.
No, not this year. You're not.
Not this year.
We'll have a discussion about that later, you and I. We have one more question. Of course, feel free to put more in the Q&A box. What would you advise to youth organizers to encourage other youth to vote or register to vote? So what's your advice to help them?
Okay, you know, in organizing, we like to say agitate. So figure out something that agitates them, but don't just leave them there. So let me think of an example on the fly. Let's say something students care about, the environment, or student debt. You know, so you can be like, hey, but aren't you pissed that that we don't have we have no legislation that incentivizes green energy, which that isn't really true. And be like, yeah, that's so dumb. Why are politicians ignoring me? And be like, well, if you actually look on this ballot, there's a proposition to put in place environmental protections. And if you go to this website, you can see a questionnaire where candidates respond to what they will do about the environment, right? So it's figuring out what the voter cares about and letting them vent, especially young people. But you as the advocate having in mind how that can be applied, how that is actually reflected in on their ballot. And reminding people, I think it's helpful to vote bottoms up, that voting locally, you have a really big impact. It's very, very reasonable to feel like I'm casting a ballot for the president. What is that going to do? Or even my senator? Like, so focusing on what happens locally. And I think another thing is that people understand that special interests and like wealthy, moneyed lobbyists have a lot of sway over politicians. And while we don't have that, what we do have is voter solidarity, right? There's a generational tension, I think, between older voters and younger voters, which is always there, and it's kind of natural. But if you think about it from the perspective of a candidate, it's the older voters that turn out to vote. So they have to persuade the older voters. So that's often why their candidate platforms will be more tailored to older voters, because they're like, well, they're the secure ones who are going to get me in place. If young people started to vote more consistently and in stronger numbers, then that is swaying and pulling the candidates to listen to them more and reflect their platform, if that makes sense. So again, we might not have the lobbyist young people, but we have is voter solidarity and that power of really turning out and showing up. That speaks to politicians.
What a great way to end this presentation. Let's get out there. Oh, we got another question. Let's see. Anonymous attendee says this has been so informative and helpful. So thank you, anonymous attendee. We'd love to know who you really are.
Although I respect your privacy, and I will send out an email a bunch of follow-up and resources probably tomorrow.
Yes, Jen respects your privacy, believe me. But on that note, I do want to thank everybody for attending this webinar tonight and spending some time with us, and thank Jen for putting this together and presenting for us tonight. We will be back on Tuesday at 6:30, same place, same time. We'll be talking about the 22-week abortion ban that we are opposed to. That may more than likely be on the ballot in November. So we all need to be educated so we can tell our friends and neighbors why they shouldn't vote for us. Vote for it, not us. Vote for us. Don't vote for the ban. So you can sign up for that webinar at peoplepower.org, or go ahead and bother Jen and she'll get you signed up for it. Oh, wait, one more question.
Bother me, that's what I'm here for.
Oh. Yes, Renee, next week's meeting is not in person. Unfortunately, we would love to have in-person meetings again, but we are respecting the social distancing guidelines. So that will be a webinar next week. Unfortunately, the system we use to set these things up kind of likes to automatically put them at our office, but we will definitely correct that, and we will be sending out webinar information prior to the meeting. So thank you for pointing that out, Renee. We appreciate that. All right, with no more questions, we are going to go ahead and close off for tonight, and hopefully we'll see you on Tuesday at 6:30. Thank you so much.
Bye.